And we're wrapping things up on a high note with none other than Tim Holley, Chief Product Officer at MyFitnessPal. Tim is a seasoned product leader with a track record of shaping innovative consumer experiences at companies like Etsy, SoulCycle, and now MyFitnessPal, where he's focused on helping millions of users make smarter choices around food, nutrition, and wellness, all really important things. Before joining MyFitnessPal, Tim spent years at Etsy leading the buyer experience during a time of major growth and transformation. And he also led both product management and product design at SoulCycle. Today, he's here to share a crucial perspective for any product leader aiming to influence at the highest level. With his talk, "The Board Doesn't Care About Your Roadmap: Running Product at the Board." Let's close out the day strong and give a huge round of applause for our final speaker, Tim Holley.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today at ProductCon New York. No pressure. I'm in the unenviable position of standing between you and happy hour, it sounds like, so maybe we'll try to keep this snappy. And Chelsea just took some of my thunder, but just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm currently the Chief Product Officer at MyFitnessPal. We're the #1 nutrition and food tracking app in the world, with a community of over 250 million users in 120 countries. Prior to MyFitnessPal, I spent over a decade at Etsy, growing from product manager to VP of product. And I had the opportunity to lead a number of teams working on the buyer experience of the marketplace, so the consumer side of the business. And during my time there, I was fortunate to help the company grow from around $500 million in sales in 2011 to close to $12 billion in sales in 2023. An incredible ride that I'm super, super thankful for. Somewhere in there, I also led the product and design team at SoulCycle. I think you heard from Drew a little earlier today. Drew and I worked together back then, if he's still here. Hi, Drew. The product community really is a pretty small world and all that. So during my time at Etsy, at SoulCycle, now at MyFitnessPal, I've had the pleasure of working with the board and key stakeholders at the executive level. Just to add a tiny little bit of dramatic flair, I actually came here directly from our Q1 board meeting, and I was worried that I'd be sweaty, all rained on, running on stage, but it actually went reasonably well. Our CTO is here somewhere, he can attest, don't just take my word for it. And so it's maybe actually gives a little bit of credence to what I'm about to say. From my experience, I can really tell you one thing, and that is the board does not care about your roadmap. Gasps, shock, horror, I know. And don't just take my word for it. Andrew Peterson, a former colleague from Etsy, who knows a thing or two about product, a thing or two about speaking to boards, and a thing or two about being on boards himself, said this: "The board doesn't care about your best-in-class experience or refactoring all that legacy code. What they care about is customer acquisition and revenue growth." What they care about is customer acquisition and revenue growth. You just heard Carlos say, revenue is a key thing that we should all be focused on. What does that mean? Well, that means that if you're a product leader at a product-led or even product-enabled company, all of you, are on the hook for driving the business forward. Now, hopefully that's not new news and isn't too scary. Now, before we jump into some specifics, I want to say that your mileage may vary from this. First off, there's no AI that we talk about here, so sorry. Second, my experience is predominantly working on consumer businesses. I'll share a lot of themes, and I think many of them are relevant for lots of different types of businesses. There is a chance, though, that some are only relevant for consumer. Third, my experience has been focused on companies and products that already have product market fit. Chances are, if you're working on something really small or maybe really early, getting into more detail with the board is actually beneficial. And then fourth and finally, having a CEO that sets the tone is really, really important. I've had the fortune of working with two CEOs who have strong, trusting relationships with their board, and that really, changes the dynamics completely. It means you're not stepping into a board meeting, in kind of a trial type situation. It's all about a conversation. And in my case, because I think I've been set up reasonably well, I can focus on, conversations and insights and action, not justifying all the little things that we might be doing. You've probably heard this before. People have said it to me. I know I've said it to people on my team. I'm sorry if you're here. But most likely, you got to where you are by being really good at your job. That probably included lots of, talking shop with your product peers, with all of the folks here, being a really great partner to your engineering counterparts, executing like crazy, and probably just obsessing over all things product. The problem is working with the board is not any of that. Board meetings, especially at private equity-backed firms, aren't for showcasing internal operations or your vision. They're about three things: performance, trade-offs, and outcomes. So fine, if you've heard that, let's try to make it a little bit more specific. What made you a great product person won't necessarily make you a great executive leader. And I do not pretend to know all the things that makes a great exec, but what I do know is that the game changes as a CPO. First, your first team is no longer your product team. Your first team is the leader of all the other functions around the business. The CMO, the CFO, head of people, head of legal, those types of folks. And of course, that trusty partner that you hopefully know how to work really well with, your CTO. Why do I mention this? Why does this matter? Well, building those relationships, investing in those relationships, means that you walk into the boardroom with advocates, people who understand what the product team is working on, why you're working on it, they're enrolled in the impact it's going to have on the business, and hopefully they're contributing to the success. So if you got hired as a product leader at the executive table, CPO, VP product, head of product, whatever, the label doesn't really matter. The chances are that the CEO has something in mind that they want you to change. You're not here just to keep the train running. And they probably have something specific in mind that they and the board want you to accomplish. And I really recommend finding out what that is before you start. Might seem a little obvious, but it'll help you understand what you're getting yourself into. And if you don't like what you hear, you can run the other way. And you use that insight, that learning, to anchor the observations that you have in your early days in the role and the findings that you share with your peers and with the board. Those early interactions that you have with the board are really important because they kind of set the tone for the future. Now, my first board meeting at MyFitnessPal was about 6 weeks after I joined. So kind of just long enough to have some cursory understanding of up from down, what the heck was happening here, but not long enough that you lose that perspective that being new brings. And I used my time with the board to share some of my early observations on the challenges and the opportunities that I observed in those early weeks. And I think that part of the exercise of this goal should be to help the board understand how well you can assess reality, how well you understand the weaknesses and the strengths of the product, the team, the company, the competitive set, maybe the industry that you're working in. And the difficult part, or one of the difficult parts, is being clear on how you'll address these things without getting into too much detail, because remember, no roadmaps. If you don't share any actions or next steps, you're kind of a consultant. And if you share too much and you fall into all of that product thinking that you're hopefully really good at, chances are you'll lose them. As part of the early diagnosis, I recommend anchoring the board on things that you plan to focus on over the next few quarters, and then updating on those things consistently. In fact, today at our board meeting, we have a few new members of the executive team, and one of our board members said, okay, these few slides, these are the things we want to come back to in the next couple of board meetings to check in on process. So repetition really matters to them. At MyFitnessPal, we're using a variation on the product, people, technology framework to share our updates. conveniently updated to be product, people, process, product, because we're product people after all. And I found that's really easy. It's a very easy to understand framework, and pretty much anything that we're sharing updates on can kind of neatly fit into one of those buckets. And then, and this might be a little hard depending on kind of the context of the business that you're working on, choose a few things that you have pretty high confidence are going to stay consistent over a few quarters, and then update on those every board meeting. In my experience, this should include some metrics that matter. Most of this should not be rocket science, right? We're here to have impact on sales, on revenue, on driving the business, so probably include those. If you've identified some leading indicators that drive the business, share those with the board, help them understand how they ladder up to revenue. And if there are some operational metrics that you're going to be focused on, maybe one or two, share those with them as well. One of the things that I'm focused on, one of the things that I've kind of been tasked with in my role at MyFitnessPal is speeding up how fast we as a product organization and company move. Now, one way we're measuring that is with experiment velocity. Now, I know it's an output metric, it's not outcomes, but it is a really easy way to understand and measure how fast we're moving over time, which in my case is ultimately really what the board cares about. And this is an admittedly very stylized version of a slide that I've shown to the board over the last year and change, and it shows two things. It shows the number of tests we've run and how long it takes to conclude them. Now, this information by itself is kind of floating in space. It doesn't mean much, especially to someone who is not, deep into the world of product and technology. So you need to ground the board in what good looks like. What are you going to do to get there? Or how far away you are from good, and then what you're going to do to get to good. But ultimately, you have to show them how moving more quickly will ultimately ladder up to driving the business. Ultimately, how will it help you win? Drive revenue, drive sales. Maybe think about this from another angle. Repetition matters because it shows consistency of thought and focus. If you show up to a meeting, board meeting, any meeting really, with a different set of things that you're focused on, it's going to be really confusing for the audience. And ultimately, I do think it reduces people's confidence in you over time. So after you've established what matters, you need to find a way to share what you're working on. And one sweet spot to go from too much detail, or to find the right balance between too much detail and too little detail, is to play the role of translator. Your job is to take a list of projects and features and share with the board why they're important and how they're going to have impact on the business, not enumerating all of the things that you're working on and launching. Maybe said slightly differently, your job is to focus them on outcomes over output. Hopefully, not something that's new to many of you or that I need to sell anyone here on. Okay, this example that I'll share is not from my experience working with the board, but it stuck with me, and I think it served me reasonably well over time. A few years ago, I was working on a company priority initiative at Etsy. This was COVID time, all very stressful, and the executive sponsor of that project was our CMO. And when I would share updates, he would always ask me, "Tim, what are the strategic implications?" when I shared anything with him. I remember thinking, what does he mean? What is he asking? What he was really asking was, how does this thing that you're talking about, that you're sharing, help us achieve our goal, and what are you going to do about it? So your job is not just to share reams of updates. It's to really stitch together the thing that you're sharing and how it's going to matter to the future of the business. These are some examples, a little bit redacted, from a few board slides at MyFitnessPal. And to be honest, my formula is pretty on the nose. Share an update, be clear about why it matters for the near and longer term decisions that we're going to make. I found it works pretty well for a variety of topics, from assessments about the current state of the product, to process and tool improvements we want to make, even to org changes that we might be working on. And given one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, is speeding up how fast we work, I tie a lot of the updates that we share not only to sales and revenue, but also to how they will help us move more quickly over time. All right, this one might be a little bit specific to consumer, so bear with me on this. But I found a lot of success in showing, not just telling the board how the experience is changing. If you're working on a consumer product, hopefully the board is at least familiar with the product. Okay, fine. Maybe they're not the target audience, maybe not power users, but at least they have some cursory understanding of how the whole thing works. And I found that sharing key visuals visuals of key changes that you have made or will make in the future gives the board members something really easy to engage with. Rows and rows of bullets, they often just get skimmed or glossed over, but screenshots really grab people's attention. This is similar to content that we shared in an Etsy board deck a few years ago, and rather than describing the changes we were making with lots of text, we simply showed what we were working on and why. I find this approach to be valuable in many instances, but not least when you're working on something that's maybe a little bit more iterative, a little bit more experimentation-driven, optimization-focused in nature. Those things can often be pretty tedious to describe in text, but when you show them in a visual, they're very, very easy to understand. Another way of doing this is the good old-fashioned side-by-side, before and after, control and test. But don't forget to share these things with, of course, you guessed it, the strategic implication of the work. One thing I don't recommend doing is sharing with board members in a board meeting that they have access to a new feature. Phones come out, heads go down, you've lost them. I made this mistake at our February board meeting, and it took a long time to get everything back on track. Don't recommend that one. In a 4 to 5 hour board meeting, like the one we had this morning, we'll typically have in the order of 30 to maybe 45 minutes to share product and engineering updates. And that's not very long, potentially an eternity if things are not going very well, which in our case, things went well, so that was good. And ideally, you're leaving time for conversation and debate. So brevity is really important. Many of you might have heard the old phrase, if I had more time, I would have written a shorter letter. Well, make sure you leave yourself enough time to draft content, share it with your CEO, your peers, your team to get feedback, and then enough time to incorporate that feedback and edit down, remembering that most details will simply not matter to the board. If you think there's going to be some specific topics that the board is going to want to dig into, maybe throw them in a skip slide, throw them into an appendix so that you can reference them if you really need to. I found that the board can often be talked about in a pretty negative way. Many of us might have done this at some point. Well, the board told us to do this, or that was the board's decision. But the reality is that board members are incredibly smart, and they really want the company to win. In a public business, they're stakeholders, they're shareholders, so they have a vested interest in the company's success. And in a private equity-owned firm, they are the direct owners of the company. They're hands-on, they're incredibly well-connected, and they typically have operational or investment backgrounds that you can leverage. I found they'll gladly help you. You just need to ask and make it easy for them to say yes. So start by identifying where they can accelerate your work. It might be partnerships, introductions to key people, recruiting, maybe even competitive benchmarking, and then send a clear, well-framed ask. Here's what we need. Here's the context. Here's what we need. And here's a note I've drafted for you that you can forward to insert person. Now, this might seem a little bit different from some of the topics we've covered so far, but I think it's really important because it builds rapport and credibility outside of that formal, often pretty infrequent, right? Once a quarter, maybe once a half, formal board update. On their behalf, it turns passive oversight into active support. And ultimately, it keeps product top of mind as a lever for growth. Quick sidebar. Do you remember earlier on I said that as a product leader, your first team is not your product team? Hopefully, this is an obvious statement, but you do not get to forget about your product team. One great way to demystify the board is to involve your team in that really fun exercise of board prep. It helps you ultimately, right? Bit less work to do. Invite them to the meeting itself, especially if they're leading a topic that you're going to dive into or where they're domain experts. And then afterwards, share action items, share notes, share key takeaways. Because without them, you probably would be that consultant that I mentioned earlier. Okay, we have now entered the phase of the talk that could also be called all the mistakes I have made. Now, this might be a little bit obvious given some of the previous points, but in the interest of clarity, I want to share a few examples of what not to do when talking to the board. One of the things that myself and my team and many others around the company worked on early in my tenure at MyFitnessPal was to define a 3-year vision and 12-month product strategy. This was a huge focus for us, and we were super excited. We had a long-form vision document that detailed what we were doing, why we were going in that direction, all the reasons to believe. We have a vision-type video that we're using internally to get everyone motivated and all, pulling in the same direction. And I took the board through all of that. The problem was I could tell I was losing them. You know that thing, right? When you look down at your phone, you're clearly checking email. That was happening here. And when I was done, the question was essentially, what impact is it going to have, and when do we start? Fair? Definitely filed that one away for future board meetings. This one is maybe a little bit cheap given the title of the talk, and I'm sure many of you love a good roadmap at some point in your careers. I know I used to finesse the heck out of those slides, and what a colossal waste of time. There's like a real sense of security in mapping out all the work that you're going to do into these neat little boxes in quarters and months. And the reality is, roadmaps nearly never get followed. Probably not lost on many of you, because reality sets in from pretty much the moment you share them. And nearly by definition, they focus on what you're doing and when, and not how the impact of the things you're working on, or what the impact of the things you're working on will be on the business. If you are getting pushed to share a roadmap, try to organize it into thematic areas. Maybe that's strategic pillar, maybe that's by metric, by customer problem, and then show work streams, not features, by quarter, maybe monthly if you really have to, so that you have some flexibility to iterate and change direction as you need. And then the final mistake here that I have made is similar to that feeling that many of you might have, I know I have, when you look at a Jira ticket and you're sitting there and you're thinking, what the heck does any of this mean? And now maybe that doesn't apply to you. You may be all much better at your jobs than I am. But jokes aside, you have to remember that board members are not working in the business day to day. They don't have the level of technical and domain expertise that you have, ultimately. That's why you're here. As an example, a few weeks ago, we invited one of our board members down to a company gathering to have a fireside chat. And one of the things he shared was that he looks for complex technical topics to be explained in very simple terms. And he said he looks for this for 2 reasons. One, to help him understand them. And by the way, he's razor sharp, so intellectual horsepower is not an issue there. And 2, so that he can get an understanding of how well the person that's explaining things really understands the topic that they're talking about. Filling, slides or decks with industry buzzwords and internal jargon is pretty much a surefire way to neither create clarity nor a shared understanding amongst non-experts. So with that, let's bring it together. In my experience, some of the key things to focus on when you're talking to your board are, 1, the impact that product changes will have on the business, both in the near and longer term. 2, the implications that learnings and decisions have for the future. 3, repeating yourself to create consistency and trust. And 4, sharing visual updates, not just walls of text, to help comprehension and to brighten up that 200-page slide deck. That is it from me. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to meeting many of you this